Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I have spent the last several hours in the 18th century. What a time to be alive. I am going to take you guys with me to Wednesday, June 6th, 1798. And I hope you're ready because there's a lot going on. Look at this beautiful newspaper. Oh my God. I will be reading from the Columbian Sentinel. It was printed on Wednesdays and Saturdays in Boston, Massachusetts. This is a real newspaper from that time. This is not a reprint or a copy. People from that time touched it, and here it is in my hands. To start off, we have, as in almost every old newspaper that I've read, ships setting sail for places. So if you're interested in going to Amsterdam, Charleston, South Carolina, or Philadelphia, and also there are some ships for sale. Don't forget to check the video description where I put links that pertain to all of these things. All of my research goes in there, so if you're into historical rabbit holes, check it out. Next, we have notice. The proprietors of the Boston Theater are hereby informed that their annual meeting stands adjourned at the second Tuesday in June, then to meet at Concert Hall at 7 o'clock, per order of trustees. According to my research, the name of the Boston Theater was the Federal Street Theater, and it was completed in 1793. It then burned down in February of 1798. This newspaper is from June of 1798. The theater was rebuilt in 9 months, and since this was published in June, that means it was published after the fire and before the rebuilding, and maybe that is why they were meeting at this other location, at Concert Hall, rather than at the theater that they represent. Next, we have lost sometime since a gold watch key fastened on a piece of the chain. Also, an oil-skinned umbrella marked with the owner's name. A suitable reward will be given. Inquire of the printer. I had never heard of a watch key before. As for oil-skinned umbrella, oil paper umbrella is, I guess, a type of parasol. So a watch key and a parasol are missing, and this person will offer a very nice reward. This is the type of mundane history that I love so much, just small things that people misplaced and lost in 1798. It's so ordinary, but still so fascinating. Next, we have something entitled French Arrogance. And the entire thing is basically saying bad stuff about France. And reading this, I was super confused. I thought maybe I was misunderstanding. Why are we talking so poorly of our allies? Because in my head, France equals ally. They helped America win the revolution, so I was confused. Well, it turns out that in 1798, the situation between America and France was not as it had been in 1783 at the end of the war. I'm going to give as brief a summary as I can, and if I make any mistakes, please don't hesitate to correct me nicely in the comments, but I did a lot of research and I went down this incredible rabbit hole of, oh yeah, I remember learning that in history class. So in 1783, for all intents and purposes, things were supposed to be nice and friendly between America and Britain. However, it wasn't that way in effect. In effect, Britain was sort of biased against America, against American ships and trade. There was just a lot going on. And in order to avoid things escalating, America sent John Jay over and he signed what is today known as the Jay Treaty, sort of smoothing things over with Britain. Now, France basically sees this as America fraternizing with the enemy, with Britain, because France at this time is in the midst of the revolution. So the French Revolution began in 1789 and the Revolutionary Wars began in 1792. France went to war with Great Britain and the US had declared neutrality. But in France's mind, the US is still their ally, not their enemy's ally. But now here's America signing a Jay Treaty with their enemy. France also sees this as a violation of the 1778 agreement between France and the US that culminated in France sending over the help that ultimately helped America win the war. Many in America felt that with the onset of the French Revolution and the French Revolutionary Wars, America's ties with France no longer existed because America had signed treaties with the French government, and by that time, by 1793, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were beheaded. There was no more monarchy, and so many in America felt that officially we didn't owe France anything. There were others, of course, who felt that we owed France a lot and saw things differently, thought that we should align with France, but ultimately we ended up staying completely neutral. Maybe you remember from Hamilton, talk about neutrality. In France's mind, the US is supposed to be their ally and not engage in anything like the Jay Treaty with their enemy. So France basically says, well, if America is going to fraternize with the enemy, we're going to treat it like the enemy. And so what ensued was never a declared war, but the actions between France and America was basically a naval war, undeclared. France started allowing for the seizure of American ships trading with Britain. I'm going to read this, and I will put the source in the video description. Between October 1796 and July 1797, more than 300 American merchant ships and their cargoes were seized in the Greater Caribbean. In response, the United States suspended repayments of war debts to France, thus moving the two nations closer to war. So America had declared neutrality during these wars that were going on, and then they have to smooth things over with Britain with the Jay Treaty, and now things are getting really tumultuous with France. So what ends up happening is President John Adams in 1797 gets a bipartisan group of 3 men and sends them to France to figure out something to smooth this over now. And the entire thing was a mess. The French foreign minister never wanted to officially meet with the Americans, and he kept on sending along intermediaries along informal channels who kept on asking the Americans for payments, which the Americans saw as demanding bribes in order to finally meet with the French foreign minister. The Americans refused to make those payments, and they were basically strung along, and then the group began to splinter, and then eventually people ended up going home. The whole thing was a mess and quite embarrassing. As this was playing out, John Adams did not want to turn over the dispatches he was receiving from these American representatives in France. He didn't want to turn those over to Congress because he feared that they would elicit a very strong reaction against France. Eventually, he did turn them over in March of 1798 after redacting the names of the French informal intermediaries with whom the Americans had met. So instead of using these French men's names, John Adams redacted them and wrote W, X, Y, and Z. And henceforth, this became known as the XYZ affair. And in my newspaper, you can actually see Messrs. W, X, Y, and Z. So this newspaper, like I said, was printed June of 1798. So the dispatches from France had already been published, and so here what we have labeled French Arrogance is an intro from the printers introducing a letter from someone named Hedouville. He's French. So basically this guy caught wind of what America was printing and talking about in terms of what was happening in France. So this French guy wrote this letter to sort of clear the air and to clear up any misconceptions. The intro from the printers says, "We know that every true American who reads it will feel a much greater share of contempt for the author than indignation." Throughout this letter, you'll see annotations A, B, C, all the way through I, that the printers basically put their rebuttals. So you see the entirety of the letter, and then you see notes and annotations where the printers are like, this doesn't make sense, this doesn't make sense, this isn't true, etc. I'm not going to read the entire thing, but here are some fun excerpts. "It was with surprise and pain, citizen, that I read in the papers arrived from the United States a libel against the chiefs of the French government, attributed to the plenipotentiaries of the federal government, and accompanying the message addressed by the President of the United States, John Adams, to the Senate and House of Representatives on the 3rd of April, 1798. He says, "As I was at Paris at the time of the negotiation, and as I am well acquainted with the propositions which were made to the commissioners of the United States by a person who was accustomed to seeing them every day, I hold it my duty to deny those scandalous imputations, the publicity of which may cause results contrary to the spirit of reconciliation which animates the two nations. I myself well know that it was the intention of the French government to demand a contribution from the American government as an indemnity for the losses which the Treaty of Commerce with England, manifest violation of neutrality on the part of the United States, caused to France. But this contribution was for the state and not for the government, and the men who have thought proper to make use of the pretext to cast the blame on the conduct of the first magistrates of a great nation disclose a secret design to hurry their fellow citizens into a war which would be fatal to them in order to gratify some private resentments or personal views. It is not thus, if I mistake not, that pacificators ought to conduct themselves. Here, he talks directly about Messrs. W, X, Y, and Z, still unnamed here, these men who met with the Americans and demanded bribes. He says, "The commissioners of the federal government confess that Messrs. W, X, Y, and Z were not possessed of any powers, and if we suppose for a moment that Messrs. W, X, Y, and Z are not mere imaginary beings, was it not the duty of the commissioners to have denounced them to the Directory? Unofficial individuals were as likely to have been agents of the Cabinet of St. James as any other government. Would it not, therefore, have been more wise in such circumstances, before so hastily publishing this libel, to have come to an explanation that might have cleared all up?" So if Messrs. W, X, Y, and Z existed at all, why would you have met with them in the first place if they were unofficial? I won't read all of the rebuffs, but I love in E, it says, "This completely lets the cat out of the bag," which I didn't realize was a saying back then, but that's amazing. This says, "Hedouville has already confessed that propositions were made to our envoys by an individual, and now he would insinuate that the persons who made the very demands he knew were to be made were agents of the Cabinet of St. James? What folly! What impudence!" On July 7th, 1798, so 1 month after the printing of my newspaper, Congress voted to revoke the existent treaty with France, and 2 days later authorized American ships to capture French ships. And so, 1 month after the printing of my newspaper here, what is called the Quasi War with France officially began. This was a quasi-war. It was never officially declared, but the actions of both sides capturing each other in this naval warfare was in effect a war. So today it's called the Quasi-War with France. In 1800, the year 1800, the Quasi-War with France was officially ended after the Convention of 1800. American representatives went to France and signed what is called the Treaty of Mortefontaine, also known as the Convention of 1800. This ended the conflict. So that is an extremely condensed version of what took place after the signing of the Treaty of Paris to this newspaper in 1798. If you're like me and you absolutely love history, especially stuff that's really niche or obscure, check out my online shop. I designed this. It says, "Only 90s kids remember the XYZ affair." It's a play on the "only 90s kids remember" thing, but it's the 1790s, so like only 1790s kids remember the XYZ affair. And that is an actual contemporary cartoon from the 1790s. It shows the three Americans, Mr. Marshall, Pinckney, and Jerry, refusing to pay the bribes that the French were demanding. Already wearing it around, I've had 2 separate people come up to me asking what it meant, so I got to go ahead and talk to these strangers about the XYZ affair and this crazy thing that happened in the 1790s that only 90s kids remember. Check out the link in the video description if you think it's as funny as I do and you want to be awesome and wear an awesome shirt. Next, we have something on the same topic, so I'm not going to read it, but it is entitled Tallien's Speech. Tallien was a French politician, and the speech is translated here for the readers of this newspaper with an introduction. The introduction says, "The following translated for your useful paper from the Chronique Universelle of February 16th must sufficiently convince the minds of many honest Americans who have sincerely believed that the rapacious conduct exercised towards our defenseless commerce by the cruisers of the French Republic was wholly unknown to their government, that the contrary of this opinion is the truth, and that a system of general plunder and depredation upon trade of neutrals has long been premeditated and is now in complete operation." I guess some Americans were still on the fence and found it hard to believe that what was happening, French ships capturing neutral American ships, whether it was just opportunistic sailors, pirates, or whether it was actually condoned by the government. So this introduction to this speech that I'm not going to read is basically saying, read this speech and you will see that the French government had full knowledge of this. It has been premeditated and that they are targeting neutral ships. Side note, one reason that I love history is because you can put things into a greater context. So right now I'm reading about the quasi-war with France and what is France going to do and why are they doing this, etc. I have the benefit of knowing how it all played out. But imagine being alive in 1798 and reading newspaper after newspaper that more and more American ships are being seized by France, your previous allies and now apparently your enemies, it would be such a confusing time, scary, especially for a fledgling nation that had not 20 years prior been in the midst of another war. It would just be a really intense thing. Now we're on the inside front page. Among other efficient proceedings this day, Mr. Harper laid on the table the following: resolved that it is expedient to suspend all commercial intercourse between the United States and the French Republic or her possessions until an adjustment of the existing differences between the two powers be effected. Also, a bill for the establishment of a battalion of Marines to consist of 500 men besides officers was ordered. Again, more about the idea of a looming war, and we need to take action, start building up our army. Next, we have new people being elected to the state senate, and we have the governor, Increase Sumner, coming in with a long speech. He says, "I recommend to your immediate consideration the necessary means of defense within this Commonwealth, that they may be used with effect whenever it shall be considered necessary by the government of the United States, particularly the important fortification on Castle Island. This fortress, so essential to the defense of the harbor and town of Boston, in case of assault or invasion, requires much labor and some expense to give it that effect in repelling an enemy, which its very advantageous situation would command. Some improvements have been made, and with but little cost to the Commonwealth, but to render it capable of internal defense, it is necessary a small work for security against small arms should be constructed in the center of the place. This might be done with great ease and at a small expense by employing the convicts on the island in that service. While we indulge the hope that the French Republic may yet alter its measures respecting the United States and render these precautionary steps unnecessary, yet I apprehend a sense of our duty and interest will not suffer us to remain unprepared for disagreeable events which so strongly threaten the peace of the United States." He's really driving home, I'm hoping for the best, but we need to prepare for the worst. In my research, I saw that Castle Island that was mentioned, there was a prison there until 1798, which is the year that this was published. And what I'm finding is that Castle Island was given to the federal government, but it wasn't used for anything until 3 years later when fortifications were built. Eventually, it was renamed Fort Independence, and I'm going to put all of this in the video description. At the very bottom here is something interesting next to this adorable little hand. It says, "We are obliged to omit many articles prepared for this day, to give place to the governor's speech. We know our correspondents will therefore readily excuse us, for we could not delay a moment in laying before them a production of such merit, uniting moderation with firmness, and the magnanimity of efficient patriotism with the investigations of philosophy." So they really loved Increase Sumner. He was very popular. He won 3 elections. He built up the state militia. Next, we have something interesting, which is John Adams actually taking the time to respond to messages he's received from the public. This says, "Gentlemen, a respectful address to the President and Congress of the United States, subscribed by 134 citizens of Roxbury, has been presented to me by Mr. Otis, your representative in Congress. Your testimony to the purity of the intentions, as well as the ability and wisdom of the administration, your approbation of their conduct, and determination to support with your lives and fortunes such measures as they shall determine most conducive to the safety and prosperity of the nation, are peculiarly agreeable to me. It is indeed devoutly to be wished that in the convulsions of Europe, America might not be involved. But the wishes and prayers of the best of men and most virtuous nations for peace are not always heard. The wishes of America have been so obviously just and reasonable that all the powers of Europe appear to have shown them some respect, excepting one which seems to have left us no alternative." Again, more and more about the budding situation with France. Next, we have ancient and honorable artillery. The anniversary of this ancient military institution was celebrated on Monday last. Though the day was not fine, the appearance and exercises of the company were highly honorable to themselves and satisfactory to all who beheld them. I had to look this up. This is the Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company of Massachusetts, which is the oldest chartered military organization in North America, chartered in 1638, and it has been meeting at Faneuil Hall since 1746. And it still happens today. Every first Monday of June, they elect their officers, and then they proceed to Faneuil Hall. Printed here are some of the toasts given. To the true friend of the American people, John Adams, may the veneration of his virtues be coextensive with the globe they have dignified, and the glory of his talents be coeval with the liberty they have perpetuated. After this toast, the Boston patriotic song, Adams and Liberty, was sung by Mr. Bowman and a select choir, and was received with unbounded applause. I'll come back to that song later. Next we have to George Washington, the farmer of Mount Vernon. May the Cincinnatus who has converted his sword into a pruning hook be ever ready at his country's call to resume his helmet and his shield and again lead her sons to victory. Song, Rise Columbia by Mr. Eaton. This is 1798, so George Washington is still alive, which is interesting. Next, to Congress, may they deliberate with magnanimity and decide with firmness. To the federal government, may the goddess of liberty cover it with her mantle and protect it from foreign influence and domestic faction. To the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, may the spirit of her sons in support of their birthright expire only with their breath. To the infant navy of America, may it prove the palladium of our commerce and the scourge and terror of pirates. Let us continue. Next we have, from the Salem Gazette of yesterday, Advices from France. I don't know who wrote this, but it's someone relaying information that they've heard. It mentions Mr. Pinckney, Mr. Marshall, and Mr. Jerry by name, which is awesome. Those were the three men who went to France during the disastrous XYZ affair. The writers of this article had been in France and they spoke with people on the street, and it says, there is no doubt that the people are heartily sick of the war and the government, but that the Directory, which is the current French government at the time, that the Directory control everything by the immense military force which they have accumulated, and which they most punctually and liberally maintain from any ample treasury. The preparations for the invasion of England, they say, are beyond all conception and wear a most serious aspect. The army destined to this expedition was supposed to consist of 150,000 men or more, and it was said that they would proceed in several divisions and to different points, reckoning upon the calculation of chances that if one failed, another might succeed. Bonaparte, as we have so often heard, was to be the commander-in-chief. So this is what word on the street is, that 150,000 men are getting ready to invade England, and that Bonaparte will lead them all. And here is what is super interesting about this. The benefit of hindsight, so I get to Google this and see what actually happened, how it actually played out. Well, what actually happened was that at this time, at the time of writing this, and I guess the news hadn't reached them yet, Napoleon Bonaparte was actually on his way to Egypt. And since he was going to Egypt, this huge invasion of England never happened. Furthermore, along with this French expedition to Egypt went along a bunch of scientists and scholars who were sent along to conduct various studies on the area. And it was through that, along with that, that the discovery of the Rosetta Stone was made. Eventually, Napoleon was defeated in the area. And in 1801, Britain took it over. Britain also took over all of the scientific discoveries that had been made by France, including the Rosetta Stone. And that is why today you will find the Rosetta Stone in the British Museum rather than in a French museum or actually home in Egypt. So not only did this grand invasion of England never happen, but Napoleon's actions eventually led to the discovery of one of the most important bits of archaeology ever discovered. It opened up the entire field of Egyptology, basically. There's, of course, a lot of controversy on the fact that Britain still holds on to the Rosetta Stone. Many feel that it should never have belonged to Britain and that it should go back home to Egypt, but it is still really fascinating to be able to trace that history and such an icon of history, the Rosetta Stone. I've been lucky enough to actually see the Rosetta Stone in person. It's a lot bigger than you'd expect. Next we have, the British troops have evacuated Port-au-Prince, Larquet, and St. Mark's, and the French have taken possession of them. That was just one sentence, but it prompted me to Google, and I learned that Port-au-Prince was a hugely profitable colony for France, but by the time of the French Revolution, a lot of different groups with a lot of different interests in Port-au-Prince were very unhappy. In 1791, inspired by the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution began to rebel against slavery and French control over the colony. And it was very complex, and it would last until 1804. I read that in 1793, the British arrived to conquer Port-au-Prince and restore order, but were unable to overtake the rebellion and ultimately withdrew in 1798, as you see here. So this one sentence is happening in the midst of all of this turmoil happening in Haiti. The Haitian Revolution is fascinating. I really recommend that you read about it. It was the first successful slave revolt in history. Next, the United States frigate of 44 guns, Captain Barry, and the Ganges of 20, Captain Dale, have sailed on a cruise to clear our coast of pirates. This refers to French pirates who had been plundering and attacking American ships. I read that Captain John Barry, mentioned here, was a hero of the American Revolution. He's been called the father of the Navy for many of his efforts and accomplishments. He was selected senior captain of the Federal Navy in 1794. The USS United States was one of the first frigates built under the Naval Act of 1794. And at the end of July, so a month later, this ship and Captain John Barry would set sail for the West Indies, where the Quasi War with France was taking place. I really recommend reading about Captain John Barry's exploits throughout his life. It's pretty fascinating. I will include some links in the video description. Next, we have Boston Directory. If any of the citizens of Boston who wish to have their names inserted in the proposed new directory have not been called upon by the person employed to take a list of the inhabitants, or if any have removed since being called upon, it is requested by the publisher that they will leave their address at his bookstore, number 75 Cornhill, immediately, as the work is now in the press and a few days' delay will render it impossible for him to accommodate them. I looked this up. This is basically the Yellow Pages. The Boston Directory was created in 1789. This is 1798, so 9 years in, and I thought that was kind of cool. Next, we have the members of the Humane Society are hereby notified that the semi-annual meeting of the said society is to be held in the representative room of the Old State House on the second Tuesday of June instant, being 12th June, at 11 o'clock, agreeably to the institution of this society, from whence they will proceed to Trinity Church, where a discourse will be delivered by the Reverend Dr. Walter on some subject connected with the principal object of this society. After which, a collection will be made for the benefit of said society. The several members of the Humane Society, and all others who incline to lend their aid to this benevolent institution, the ladies in particular, are requested to give their attendance. The ladies. I actually found the discourse that was presented on that day online, so you can actually read it. And I had to look up what the Humane Society was back in 1798. And it was formally established in 1786, and this society was concerned about the loss of life from shipwrecks and ships in distress. They're basically considered a precursor to the Coast Guard in a way, and they maintained lifeboats and rescue stations along the coast. And they still exist today. Check the video description to learn more. Next, we have $200 reward. Lost, supposed to be stolen on Thursday last at Jones and Bass's Auction, Boston. A black leather pocketbook containing $475 in Salem, Newbury, and Gloucester bills with other valuable papers. The above reward will be given for the pocketbook with the contents and $200 added for the thief when convicted. Someone has to help me here because I'm confused on how much $200 is, because it says $200 in Salem, Newbury, and Gloucester bills. So how much does that equal today? Let me know, because this seems like specific local money, so I don't know how to research that. $200 seems like a lot. Next we have Adams and Liberty, just published. The Boston Patriotic Song, written by Thomas Paine. This is the same song that was sung after the toast to John Adams at the Ancient and Honorable Artillery. Here it is for sale. I guess just a little booklet, maybe with the music notes written. I found it online, and if you want to hear that song, you can. Check the video description. It says here that this song was written by Thomas Paine, but it is not the same Thomas Paine. Apparently, this Thomas Paine eventually changed his name in 1801 in order to differentiate himself from the other Thomas Paine that we all know. Next, we have Wanted. In a family consisting of a gentleman and lady only, a good disposition, middle-aged woman who can cook and do all kinds of housework. Also, a capable young manservant that will be grateful for good wages and kind treatment. Those that apply must have recommendations from their last place and must leave their names at the Sentinel office. Simple things like this please me. Next. Now we're on the back. Here we have Thomas Godfrey Baker informs his friends and customers and purchasers of hard bread in general that he has on hand a large quantity of ship bread, groat biscuit, and crackers, which he will sell on the most reasonable terms. I thought this was cool. Someone selling hard tack, which is like this hardened bread. It's almost like a cracker. It keeps forever, and that's why it was often eaten on ships. People still eat hardtack today, but I somehow still associate it with like pirates and hundreds of years ago, so it's cool to see. I once made hardtack just to see what it would be like, and I almost lost a tooth. I think you're supposed to like mush it up in your soup or something, or get it soft again, and I did not do that. And here again we have For Sale, Adams and Liberty. So I guess this song was really kind of a hit at the time, and it was making waves, and everyone was trying to sell it. Must have been a real chart topper. We also have more music for sale. The truly federal song, Hail Columbia, Death or Liberty, to the tune of The President's March, adapted for the voice, pianoforte, violin, guitar, clarinet, hautboy, German flute, or any other instrument. Hail Columbia was basically at that time the unofficial national anthem. It was composed in 1789 as the President's March, and then lyrics were added in the spring of 1798, which is what they are talking about here. And if you want to hear that song, check the video description. Here we have This Day Published and For Sale by S. Hall, a discourse delivered at the Roman Catholic Church in Boston on the 9th of May, 1798, a day recommended by the President for humiliation and prayer throughout the United States, by the Reverend John Thayer, Catholic missionary, published at the pressing solicitation of those who heard it. And below that, This Day Published and For Sale by S. Hall, number 53 Cornhill, a sermon delivered at the New North Church in Boston in the morning and in the afternoon at Charlestown, May 9th, 1798, being the day recommended by John Adams, President of the United States of America, for solemn humiliation, fasting, and prayer, by Jedediah Morse. I didn't know what this was, so I looked it up, and apparently this was, I guess, a tradition that began in 1775 with the Continental Congress issuing a proclamation for this type of day, and George Washington did it, and John Adams did it, and a few other times throughout the country's history. Next, we have one of my absolute favorite finds from this newspaper. To the gentlemen and ladies of Boston, Mr. Liege, or Mr. Leger, I am not sure, dancing master, intending to fix his future residence in Boston, informs the gentlemen and ladies of this town, who should be willing to entrust him with the care of their children, in that elegant branch of polite education, that he has taken Mr. Dearborn's new hall in Milk Street, where he has opened his dancing school, and will continue open every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Mr. Liege flatters himself that all his attention shall be devoted to the improvement of his pupils. He will teach every kind of dance, such as the minuet de la cour, allemande, cotillion, hornpipe, etc., etc. He promises that at the end of 2 quarters, his pupils shall be enabled to dance in an easy and elegant style, every dance they will undertake to learn. What's interesting is that in my research, I saw that Mr. Liege taught ballet to victims of the fire, of the Federal Street Theater fire. And after the fire, he decided to open a dancing school for children in Mr. Dearborn's hall. So Mr. Liege here was actually affected by that fire that we read about before. I love the idea of a dancing school in 1798, and if I were a parent back then, I would absolutely send my child to become much more refined and educated in these wonderful dances. I love this idea so much that I designed this t-shirt and notebook. Check the links in the video description if you want to feel like an alum of Mr. LEGE'S dancing school. Talk about esoteric. Class of 1798 represent. This is honestly one of my favorite things that I've ever made, ever. Moving on, we have more books for sale, Bibles and school books of all kinds, and we also have a few ladies' memorandum books for the year 1798 containing a variety of useful, ornamental, and instructive articles. Apparently ladies' memorandum books were sort of like small almanacs or pocket journals. Down here we have a poem for sale in 2 cantos entitled Imagination in Search After Happiness by Joshua and John Atwood, probably Atwood, price 9d. I tried to find this online, but I couldn't find any version to read for free, so if anyone can find that poem, I'd love to read it. Here we have something interesting. Wanted, Smith's History of New Jersey. Any person who has it in his possession and is disposed either to sell or lend it will much oblige the subscriber by giving information. Jeremy Belknap. I found this online, and the first history of New Jersey was written by Samuel Smith and published in 1765. And if you check the video description, you can read it in its entirety, this book that Jeremy Belknap really wanted to read. It's also interesting because at that time, you know, if your local library didn't have this specific book you had heard of, how else are you going to find it? You can't order it from Amazon. So I guess taking out an ad in a newspaper saying, if anyone has it, I want to read it, is kind of the only way to go. So that's kind of interesting. Different times. Here we have Strayed. On Monday evening last, from Mr. Connor's stable in Marlborough Street, a light chestnut mare about 7 or 8 years old, a white stripe in her face, about middling size, trots all, was seen going over the new bridge with a halter about her neck. Whoever has found and will return her to the above stable shall be handsomely rewarded and be paid necessary expenses. So here we have a horse that has broken free. She has found her freedom, made a run for it, and this person is desperately hoping that she will be brought back. I think horses at that time were a really hot commodity and would probably cost a lot, so I can see why they're offering a reward, but I can also see that horse never returning. And last but not least, we have Wanted in a small family 5 miles from Boston, a woman as chambermaid who understands sewing, also a boy to tend a horse, who will have the privilege of going to school. Inquire at the printer. The privilege of going to school. So this boy would be able to get an education while also taking care of a horse. Sounds like a pretty sweet deal for a child. And those were the stories of the day on Wednesday, June 6th, 1798. I hope you enjoyed venturing back in depth into the 18th century with me. Please consider subscribing if you haven't already. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Follow me on Instagram, and I will see you next time.